Okay, I think we are live now. Hello everyone, my name is Neeraj Attri, and first of all, I'll take this opportunity to thank Think India Telangana, who've given me this wonderful chance to interact with all of you. And I'll start with my own introduction. Briefly, I've been teaching physics for last about 20 years to students aspiring to go into various engineering and medical colleges. And just accidentally I somehow walked out into uh, the domain of history, which is not my primary interest or primary area of interest. I hope we are live already. Can you kindly just text a message that we are live? Okay. So as I was giving you an idea of my introduction, I've been an ordinary kind of guy who was never ever interested in history or in religion, and as far as I remember, during my entire uh, okay, during my entire student life, I never liked history as a subject. And after my graduation and when I started teaching, I was under this impression that history is one of those subjects which should never ever be taught because it is just a wastage of time. The only subjects which should be taught in schools and colleges are science and mathematics. That's it. But then, as I started delving into history, I found out that there is something very wrong. Now, before I move on to what actually I had planned for today's lecture, I'm changing the content a little bit. Due to yesterday's news, which appeared that when there was a leveling program going on in Ayodhya, they found out new artifacts, new idols, and various such articles which indicate that there was a very large temple complex beneath the mosque structure which had been demolished. Now, how is it possible that in a democratic country like ours, a truth can be hidden from general public for such a long period of time? For this, we have to understand how the narrative is controlled through media and through education system. What I will do is I'll give you one example. This example pertains to an incident which took place about 35 years ago. In 1985 and 1986, what was happening? Archaeological Survey of India was conducting some repairs and some renovations in and around what we today call Qutub Minar complex. And during the process of renovation, the workers of Archaeological Survey of India found out that some idols were present in the walls of the Qutub Minar. The Times of India during those days picked up the story, put in a photograph of the idols, and created a news item which said that these idols have been found out in Qutub Minar complex. Now imagine 35 years ago, a mainstream newspaper reporting that there were some idols which had been present in Qutub complex. It created a lot of controversy over there. After that, this was most probably in August of 1986. In next month, that means in September 1986, another news appeared which said that some people in Mathura have formed a committee, and the aim of the committee is to create a grand Krishna Janmabhoomi temple in Mathura. And then again, some letters to editors were coming in those days. Those were the days when there was no internet. So what happened was that people were arguing in favor of it and against it also. Then suddenly what happened? a letter was received by Times of India, by the editor of Times of India. This letter was written by some very eminent historians. One of them was Romila Thapar, one was Harbans Mukhia, who is still a historian, who is still considered a historian, one was Bipin Chandra, and then there were some other names. Okay, now the letter was, I'll start reading this letter for you. Now see what was happening. Again, let us just recollect what was going on there. Some people had formed a committee that they are going to get a grand Krishna Janmabhoomi temple built up in Mathura. In this backdrop, now I'm going to read some portions of that letter for you. The letter written by these historians was, the Dera Keshav Rai temple was built by Raja Bir Singh Deo Bundela during Jahangir's reign. This large temple soon became extremely popular and acquired considerable wealth. Now just focus on this one line. The Dera Keshav Rai temple was built by Raja Bir Singh Deo Bundela during Jahangir's reign. So the assertion here is that Jahangir was a Muslim ruler and he permitted this temple to be built. That is number one. Second, this temple soon became extremely popular and acquired considerable wealth. So it was a wealthy temple. Now let us move ahead. Aurangzeb had this temple destroyed, took the wealth as booty and built an Eidgah on the site. After this, the next sentence is, his actions might have been politically motivated as well, for at the time when the temple was destroyed, he faced problems with the Bundelas as well as Jat rebellions in the Mathura region. It should be remembered that many Hindu temples were untouched during Aurangzeb's reign and even some new were built. Okay. Now in this one paragraph, you can understand the import of entire letter. That what they're trying to state is that one Muslim ruler allowed to be built, it was built, then it became wealthy, Aurangzeb looted it and demolished it and created an Eidgah over there or a Islamic structure on it. Now let us move ahead. It cannot be denied that acts of intolerance have been committed in India by followers of all religions, but these acts have to be understood in their context. It is a debasement of history to distort these events for present day communal propaganda. Now what you have to remember is that for these people, every time is a communal time. There is never ever a time to discuss history with these people, because always there is some surcharge atmosphere, someone is committing some kind of mischief in the nation. Now what I would suggest is, we go over this one by one. As far as facts are concerned, what they have stated is that it was built by Raja Bir Singh Bundela during Jahangir's reign. It is absolutely correct. Now what is not correct, or what they have not stated, is why Bir Singh Bundela chose to build this temple at that particular site. Yeah. The reason for this is that a temple had existed, just a minute. A temple had existed at that particular site for many centuries. How can we say that it existed for many centuries? Like yesterday's news, which tells us that Ayodhya was a site of a very ancient temple. A very large number of archaeologists have carried out their expeditions, have carried out their investigations in Mathura also, and one of them was conducted by Pandit Radhakrishnan in 1913. I'll read his quote for you. An inscription of Swami Mahakshatrap Shodash recovered in 1913 testifies that a temple dedicated to Vasudev existed at Mathura in the 1st century BC. That means 2100 years ago, still a temple existed over there, and the temple was dedicated to Lord Krishna. Moreover, there are more than a dozen epigraphic evidences of existence of Keshav Rai temple since last 2000 years. This is what these eminent historians deliberately suppressed. Now let us move on to the next sentence. Temple became extremely popular and acquired considerable wealth. Aurangzeb had this temple destroyed, took the wealth as booty and built an Eidgah on the site. Now this is a standard filter which is used by these eminent historians to hide the depravity of the ideology which these kings represented. Why was this temple demolished? Because in 1669, Aurangzeb had given a specific farman that all the temples and all the schools of non-Muslims in entire region should be demolished. So it had nothing to do with wealth of a temple. It was a blanket order that all the religious institutions and educational institutions should be demolished. His sentence was, the emperor ordered the governors of all provinces to demolish the schools and temples of the infidels and strongly put down their teachings and religious practices. I am quoting this from Masiri Alamgiri, which is known as Court Records of Aurangzeb or the Akhbarat of Aurangzeb. And that means when this order was issued in April 1669, nearly about 1 year, in the month of January 1670, the temple was demolished. And you know what? Nowadays Ramzan is going on, and there is this impression being created that it is a very holy month. Now the word holy can mean different things to different people. In this month of Ramzan only, the temple had been demolished. Next filter that they use is, his actions might have been politically motivated. So it can be politics, but it does not involve religion of that particular individual. Let us look at that also. Now, when Aurangzeb had taken up the throne, he was facing rebellion from very large number of population, from very large number of kings, and some of the local rulers were also Muslims. But he did not give order to demolish a single mosque. The order was to demolish the temples and the educational institutions of infidels or kafirs. Next trick that they played was, he faced problems with the Bundelas as well as Jats. Now, Bundelas were a warrior class in North and Middle India. They kept on their resistance during the entire Muslim rule, but as far as specifically in that time period this rebellion is concerned, there was no Bundela rebellion going on, because the first major rebellion of Bundelas was in 1635. That means almost 35 years before the temple was demolished, and Shah Jahan had put it down. The next rebellion of Bundelas was in 1661. That means 7 years before this incident had taken place, and again the chief of the Bundelas had been killed by Aurangzeb himself. So there was no chance of a Bundela rebellion, due to which he destroyed the temple. And then they have stated that as well as Jat rebellions in the Mathura region. So what they are trying to say is that because Jats had rebelled against Aurangzeb, that is why he destroyed the temple or demolished the temple. The truth is exactly 180 degrees opposite to it, that because he had issued this farman to demolish Hindu temples, that is why Jats had rose in rebellion against Aurangzeb. So it is a classic example of putting the cart ahead of the horse. Now next is, why I am stating this to you is because like we saw yesterday, that still idols are being taken out of Ayodhya. Same scene will be repeated when the focus will, or the spotlight will shift over to Mathura. Because in Mathura again, since there are a large number of people who are asking for handing over of the Eidgah to Hindus, so that a grand Krishna temple can be built over there. This is a standard template which is used by these so-called historians to obfuscate the facts or to obfuscate the truth. Now, the question that we should ask ourselves is that what is wrong with our institutions, what is wrong with our historians? How can such a brazen lie be perpetrated in the name of history? What I would suggest is that we start looking at the bigger picture, that how this kind of patronage started to be given to vested interests. The template of this falsification of history was started much earlier. Just a minute. The pioneer of this kind of nonsense was our first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm going to quote from one of his books, which is Glimpses of World History by Pandit J.L. Nehru. This book, Glimpses of World History, tells us it gives us some idea about how this falsification of history was planned even before the independence was granted to our country. I'm going to read 2 lines for you. Now, in this book, Nehru is talking about a person called Tamerlane, who is known as Temur Lung. He was a Mongol who invaded India, and all the Mughals proudly claim their descent from Tamerlane or Temur Lung. What Nehru writes about him is, the wealth of India attracted this savage. So this first line is very important, that he was a savage, all right, let us accept this much. But what attracted him was the wealth of India. So it again had nothing to do with religion. Now the fact is that Temur was a devout Muslim, and he was a master of the Islamic scriptures. He has written his own book, his own memoirs. These are known as Malfuzti Timuri or Tezuki Timuri. What he records in his own memoirs, now I'm going to quote that to you. About the year 1398 contemporary era, there arose in my heart the desire to lead an expedition against the infidels and to become a champion of the faith. So you notice that he himself is proclaiming that he decided to take an expedition of jihad, but our Pandit Nehru is trying to secularize him. Now I'll go further. For it had reached my ears that the slayer of the infidels or killer of the infidels is a champion, and if he is slain, he becomes a martyr. The actual terms he used are Ghazi and Shaheed. That if you kill the infidels during your jihad, you are called a Mujahid and a Ghazi, and if you die, you are called a Shaheed. So either way, this is a classic case of having a laddu in both your hands. If you live, still you enjoy. If you die, still you enjoy. Okay. Now, it was for this reason that I formed my resolution, but I was undermined in my mind whether I should direct my expedition against the infidels of China or against the infidels and polytheists of India. So he minces no words. He is absolutely clear that he has decided to undertake a jihadi expedition. The intention is to kill infidels or non-Muslims. The only confusion is whether he should kill the Chinese infidels or the mushriks of India. Now the term polytheist is actually mushrik. Mushrik means anybody who worships idols or who worships any god except by the name of Allah. So all Hindus, all Buddhists, all Jains, all Sikhs, they are kafirs by the very definition of Islam. Then further he elaborates, if still there is any doubt, in this matter I sought an omen from the Quran, and the verse to which I opened was this: O Prophet, make war upon the infidels and unbelievers and treat them with severity. So he opened up Quran and found out this verse which was exhorting Muslims to go and wage jihad against non-Muslims. That is why he decided that now he is going to attack India or the infidels of India. Then next he says, he asked the amirs and the leaders to be assembled before him and asked whether he should direct his expedition against Hindustan or China. Some amirs told him about the 4 defenses of Hindustan, dash dash dash. I'm going to skip this. Now, his nobles are not in favor of attacking India because it is considered to be a very hostile country, but somehow he decides to do it. Why did he decide to go to India instead of China? He tells us, at this time, the wise men of Islam came before me, and a conversation began about the propriety of a war against the infidels and polytheists, whereupon they declared that it is the duty of Sultan of Islam and all those who profess that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah to exert their utmost endeavor for the suppression of the enemies of the faith, for the sake of preservation of their religion and strengthening their law. They likewise said it is the duty of every Muslim and true believer to use his utmost exertions in obedience to his ruler. Now he says, when edifying words of the wise men reached the ears of the nobles, all their hearts were set upon a holy war in Hindustan, and throwing themselves on their knees, they repeated the chapter of victory which opens the Quran. Now this is a classic example of the kind of negationism that is practiced in our country. The first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, set this ball rolling, and all the subsequent historians have been following this template only, except a few honest ones. So here you notice that the person himself is claiming that he is waging a jihad against India, but our Prime Minister, whom we ideally should be trusting that he's our defender or he's our protector, he is misguiding us to the path that it had nothing to do with Islam. Then further what he states is, when I girded up my loins for the expedition, I wrote to Hazrat Sheikh. So what actually comes out of all this is that it is entirely based on the Islamic theology and Islamic scriptures, which forced all these marauders to come into India to loot, plunder, rape and capitulate the land. But we have been misguided into believing that it had nothing to do with religion. Now, second interesting thing, then he quotes in his book, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru quotes in his book, when Timur came to India with an army of Mongols, there was not much resistance and he went on massacres and pyramids. Both Hindus and Muslims were slain. No distinction seems to have been made. The prisoners becoming a burden, he ordered all of them killed and 100,000 were massacred. Now actually what had happened was that when Tamerlane was passing through India, when he reached Delhi, he had to attack the Delhi king at that time. By this time they had captured more than 1 lakh prisoners and all of them were Hindus. So he gave a strict command to all his officers that you have to go into the camps and kill each and every Hindu in that. Whereas we are being told that there was no distinction being made between Hindus and Muslims. This should tell you what kind of perverted history we've been taught for last about 70-75 years. And it has been done with the patronage of the state. I'll give you one more example. This is regarding Mahmud Ghaznavi. What Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru wants us to believe is about Mahmud Ghaznavi. Buildings interested him and he was much impressed by the city of Mathura. About this he wrote, there are here 1,000 edifices as firm as the faith of the faithful. Nor is it likely that this city has attained its present condition, but at the expense of many millions of dinars, nor could such another be constructed under a period of 200 years. So if we take up this passage from our first Prime Minister, what he is stating is that buildings interested him. So he was some kind of an art lover. When he came to Mathura, he fell in love with the buildings which were present in the city at that time. Now, what did he do? The next sentence which he has deliberately omitted is, the Sultan gave orders that all the temples should be burnt with naphtha and fire and leveled with the ground. Notice the level of mischief, that such a barbaric ruler who destroyed hundreds of temples of Mathura, by just removing this one sentence, you convert him into an art lover who fell in love with the city of Mathura. And he was interested in buildings and temples. Now, why I discuss this with you is because such kind of false narrative is being peddled at every level, at school level, at college level, at university level also. And this distorted narrative is perpetrated not only by education system, also by media and also by the intellectuals. So you have to remember that all these pillars whom we trust are in fact working against our interests. Then regarding Babur, what are we being told by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru? And the mainstream narrative is, Babur was one of the most cultured and delightful persons one could meet. There was no sectarianism in him, no religious bigotry, and he did not destroy as his ancestors used to. So this is what we are being told, and what Babur himself tells us. Now let us look at that also. I am quoting from Baburnama. Chanderi had been in the Darul Harb for some years. Darul Harb is an Islamic concept. According to the Islamic theology, the entire world is divided into two parts. The part which is ruled by the laws of Islam is known as Darul Islam, whereas the land which is governed not by the laws of Islam but by the laws of non-Muslims is known as Darul Harb. Now he is talking about Chanderi, where Rana Sanga used to lead. Chanderi had been in the Darul Harb, that means Hindu rule, for some years and held by Sanga's highest ranking officer Medini Rao, with 4,000 or 5,000 kafirs or infidels. But in 1527-28, through the grace of Allah, I took it by force, within a ghadi or two, massacred the infidels and brought it into the bosom of Islam. So again, the perpetrator himself is claiming that his acts are directly attributed to Islam, but we, the infidels, are being fed a narrative that it had nothing to do with Islam, and in fact Babur was the most cultured and delightful person one could meet. No bigotry, no sectarianism was present in him. This is the quotation I've taken from Baburnama, page 331. Now, this was one portion which I wanted to cover to convey to you how a falsification of history keeps on taking place. The part 2 which I wanted to cover today with, or discuss today with you, was that how the tradition of our country are being underplayed. There are two aspects, two sides of the same coin, you can consider them. Everything that came from outside of India, for example Islam and Christianity, they are always said to be very positive, very good and very egalitarian in nature, whereas all the traditions which originated in our country are downplayed or portrayed to be regressive and debauched. How it is done, I'll share with you one anecdote for this. Nearly 100 years ago, in 1926, a Christian lady, a Christian missionary by the name of Catherine Mayo came from America to India. This Mayo is M-A-Y-O, Mayo. She came to India in 1920s, roamed about in different parts of our country, and then she wrote a book titled Mother India. This book showcased all the negative aspects of India and its civilization. You must have noticed that if you have to build a narrative, what you should do? Suppose a foreigner comes to our country. One option is he clicks images of the drains of our country, the starving people, the poor people, and then post them back home, and that creates a narrative that India is a country which is which is ridden with poverty and with malnutrition and all the ill effects. Or you can take pictures of the malls present over here, the swanky cars which are going on the highways, and all the material progress which has taken place. Then you can change the narrative. Now this lady, Catherine Mayo, what she did was, she created a very negative image of India. And 100 years ago, when this was done, it created a huge uproar in the entire country. And all prominent people of our country who loved it, they resisted this book. For example, Lala Lajpat Rai wrote a 600 pages book titled Unhappy India, in which he rebutted all the claims which were being made by this lady called Catherine Mayo. Mahatma Gandhi gave a statement for this book. I am reading this for you. This book is cleverly and powerfully written. The carefully chosen quotations give it the false appearance of a truthful book, but the impression it leaves on my mind is that it is the report of a drain inspector sent out with one purpose of opening and examining the drains of the country to be reported upon, or to give a graphic description of the stench exuded by the opened drains. If Miss Mayo had confessed that she had come to India merely to open out and examine the drains of India, there would perhaps be little to complain about her compilation, but she declared her abominable and patently wrong conclusion with a certain amount of triumph: the drains are India. That is Mahatma Gandhi quoting for you. Now, imagine it this way, that you invite somebody to your home, and he, instead of looking at all the decorations which you've done, he goes and opens up the drain of your house, and then the stench that comes out, he starts reporting about that stench. Then that is exactly what Catherine Mao had done. Now, in last 100 years, in our country, we have a very large number of individuals who have got the same mindset. I call them Maoists, not Maoists. It is M-A-Y-O-I-S-T, Maoists. They are infatuated with the idea that nothing in India can be good. Everything, every tradition of this country is bad. It has always been bad, and nothing worthwhile has ever been produced by this nation. And you must remember that you will find such people around you in every sphere of life. How this is achieved, now I'm going to share that with you. When the Britishers came over here, they had come from Europe, which had a very peculiar mindset. For centuries, they had been oppressed by church and missionaries. They were living in a society where there was only one book called Bible, and even that Bible was not within reach of normal Europeans. In fact, when printing press was invented, the first book to be printed was Bible, and a major chunk of population was not even permitted to read it. Especially women were forbidden from reading Bible. When these people came to this country of ours, they were surprised and astonished. They saw that here they have a very large library of books. But the mindset still remained the same, that they must be having one book which governs their life. But they were unable to pinpoint to that single book. Now, when they started looking at all these books, they found that they have been very strictly categorized. One of the categories is Shruti, second is Itihas, third is Smriti, fourth is Darshan Shastra, fifth is Puran. Purana is what we call. Now they found out that there are 5 distinct genres or 5 different categories of books which are present in this country. Then they inquired that, okay, Shruti is what is considered to be most authentic. Let us look at that. Now when they started looking at it, they found out that there are, the Vedic corpus has 4 Veds: Rig Ved, Sam Ved, Yajur Ved and Atharva Ved. Now again that posed a problem. See, what has to happen is, if anybody has to conduct a propaganda, there are very simple basic rules to conduct it. You have to pick up 5, 6, 7 phrases, keep on hammering them again and again, so that they get registered in the mind of people. And the template on which the colonialists were working was, there should be a binary of exploiter and exploited, so that this can be hammered in the minds of people that there, just like in Europe, the clergy was oppressing and the ordinary people were being oppressed. They had to find out some method to impose or to force the same kind of template on India also. Now these 4 Veds, or Vedas if you call them, were posing a problem for them. When they further tried to study each one of those books, for example, let us say Rig Ved, then they found out that for every Ved, there are still further books. There are Samhitas, then Upanishads, Brahman Granths and Aranyaks. That again posed a problem for them. Then the next problem that arose was that it is not only Rig Ved, Sam Ved, Yajur Ved, there are Vedangs also. That means books which are ancillary or subsidiary to these Vedas. These are Shiksha, Chand, Vyakaran, Nirukt, Kalp and Jyotish. So they were disoriented that what should we do about this. Then they said that let us focus on some other aspect, some other category of books. Now the second category could have been the Darshan Shastras. We have 6 schools of Darshan: Patanjali's Yoga Darshan, then Nyaya Darshan, Sankhya, Vaisheshik, Purva Mimamsa, Uttar Mimamsa. The content of these books has nothing sectarian within them, so they could not be used as tools of propaganda. Then they thought that let us look at Purans. Now when you look at Puran, they also have a limitation that one Puran can be absolutely contradictory to the second Puran, and one may be dedicated to one deity, the other may be dedicated to some other deity. That was again a problem. So Purans were also rejected. Ultimately what they did was, they decided that okay, what we will do is, we'll focus on Smritis, and out of hundreds of Smritis which had been developed in India, they decided to pick one of them, and that was Manusmriti. Now you must remember that Manusmriti is the most abused book in our country, and whether rightly or wrongly, we'll find it out. Now before we start with Manusmriti, or what is ailing this narrative, let us try to understand it this way. When you have to conduct a propaganda, you require a very large bureaucracy to push that idea, and to push that idea you have to take hold of some negative aspects and then keep on hammering them. There is a very interesting quotation from Al-Biruni. I am going to quote that for you. About 1000 years ago, when Mahmud Ghaznavi invaded India, with him he had his own chronicler whose name was Al-Biruni. He has written a book which is known as Kitab al-Hind. Now this Kitab al-Hind is very hefty book, and it has been translated by a German person called Dr. Edward Sachau. I am quoting just 2 sentences from this translation. It is page number 125 and 126. He is talking about Hindus and the Hindu civilization of India. He says, they do not allow the Veda to be committed to writing. Okay, now we've had a millennia old oral tradition, that Rig Ved, Samved, all these books have been learned by heart. They've been memorized by Shishya Guru Parampara, and they've been transmitted from one generation to the other. That is what he is stating, that they do not allow the Veda to be committed to writing because it is recited according to certain modulations, and they therefore avoid the use of the pen. This is very important for us to understand. What he is saying is that in the tradition of Indians or the tradition of Hindus, writing is not considered good. Oral traditions are preferred, and that is why they put it in specific meters or chand, because since it is liable to cause some error, use of pen, since it is liable to cause some error and may occasion an addition or a defect in the written text. Now try to imagine this. Before printing press came, all the books were written by hand. So now suppose I have a copy of Manusmriti with me. Somebody comes from a town 100 kilometers away. He wants to take a copy of Manusmriti. He'll have to note it by hand. And if he has to make any deletion or addition into it, it is very easy. He just has to add 2-3 verses from his own side and claim that it is the original Manusmriti. It could be done, and that is why I think that our ancestors were so far-sighted that they decided that it should not be written, it should be committed to memory, and that also in meters and chands, so that nobody can tamper with it very easily. Now, but what happened was that most probably during the last 2-3 millennia, there were some additions or some deletions from Manusmriti, and what we today find is a distorted version of Manusmriti. And that is precisely the reason today if you go to market, you will find two kinds of Manusmritis. One which contains very large number of very bad verses, which talk about discrimination on the basis of birth, which talk about misogyny. On the other hand, you find out these critical editions of Manusmriti, which talk about or which have purged all these interpolations or extrapolations, and they say that now that we have a purified form of Manusmriti, we can stick to it. That is purely Indian tradition, that we can question anything. It's not a book written in stone that we have to follow. In fact, the very concept that you have to follow a single book is very alien to India, and it is considered something very obscene, if I may use a word. Now, what you have to remember is that from hundreds of different books, from the entire Vedic corpus, from Vedas, Upanishads, Aranya Granths, Shad-darshans and so on, when you zero in only on one book, that is Manusmriti, you are committing a grave error. But since you have to propagate a distorted version, it is very easy to just focus on a single book and then attribute all the ills of the society in that single book. It's very easy to do. How it is done? With the use of education system, with the use of school education. I'm giving you an example for that. I'm quoting from page number 39 of class 12th. The title is Differences in Rural Society. What you have to remember is, if you have to break a society, if you have to disintegrate a society, you must focus on differences. If you have to bring cohesion in the society, you must focus on the commonalities. The NCERT books which were introduced in 2005-2006, they are very insidious books, and they focus only on the differences, and wherever there are fault lines, they pinpoint to those fault lines and then try to magnify those fault lines, and stating that this country was always bad, has always been bad. Like I said, that the typical Maoist trick is being used in these history textbooks. I'm going to quote it for you. The title is Differences in Rural Society. What they are saying is, it is likely that these differences were based on differential access to land. Remember, they are saying it is likely. They're not giving any evidence for that. It is likely that these differences were based on differential access to land, labor, and some of the new technologies. In such a situation, questions of control over land must have become crucial. Notice the style of history writing. First, it is likely that it would have happened, so they don't have any surety about that. And then, in the very next sentence, in such a situation, questions of control over the land must have become crucial. So from an uncertainty, you deduce a result that it must have happened. It must have become crucial, as these were often discussed in legal texts. So now what you have done, you added another nonsensical term, which is legal texts. Now I'm coming on to this portion. The same page, page number 39, what they're saying is, the Manusmriti is one of the best known legal texts of early India, written in Sanskrit and compiled between 2nd century BCE and 2nd century CE. So what they have done is, now here, this is the entire mischief, that you have ignored all other books, you've picked up one single book, and then you are deliberately stating that it was a legal text. Now let us examine this angle also. How can you say that one text is a legal text? Let us put it to question. One method can be that the author of the book, if he claims that I am writing this as a legal text or a constitution, that can be the first test. Did the sage Manu ever claim that he is writing a legal text? The answer is absolutely no. The Rishi Manu nowhere claims that he is writing a legal text. So the answer to first question is negative. Now let us move on to second one. A legal text is one which has to be backed by an enforcement agency. In entire history, we do not find any king who states that Manusmriti is to be the canonical book of his kingdom. Remember, we have such a large country and a documented history of nearly 5,000 years. No king states that I am using Manusmriti as a legal text. Still, our students are being told that it is a legal text. Okay. The third test can be, did any ruler ask Manu to compile this law book or a legal book? The answer again is no. No ruler asked him to do it. In fact, in the beginning of Manusmriti itself, it tells us that some sages, some wise men went to Manu and started asking him about the kind of life one should lead. That is how Manusmriti came into existence. Fourthly, the way of life that Manusmriti teaches is in the form of suggestions. It is prescriptive in nature. Whereas if it is a law book, it has to be mandatory to follow. But there is no punitive what should I say? There is no punishment prescribed that if somebody does not follow, he will be punished by the state. There is no such thing. So you can understand that out of all these 4 questions, the answer is negative. You can never ever claim that it is a legal text, but still, because a propaganda has to be conducted and our students have to be fed that this country was suffering from a large amount of discrimination, that is why Manusmriti is being pushed as a legal text. Anyway, let us still move further. Now, excuse me. On the same page, page number 39 of class 12, what it further states is, seeing that, now this is a quotation from Manusmriti, seeing that in the world controversies constantly arise due to the ignorance of boundaries, he should have, now here he is the king, that Manu has given advice to the king, he should have concealed boundary markers, buried, stones, bones, cow's hair, chaff, ashes, potsherds, dried cow dung, bricks, coal, pebbles and sand. He should also have other similar substances that would not decay in the soil, buried as hidden markers at the intersections of boundaries. And then they ask a question, would these boundary markers have been adequate to resolve disputes? Now try to understand this mischief. What they are doing is, a class 12 student is about 17-18 years of age. They are saying that we are quoting from your book Manusmriti that the king is being advised to conceal boundary markers, and he is saying that we are going to resolve the disputes. Then they ask the question, would these boundary markers have been adequate to resolve disputes? Now a student who is reading it will be disgusted that such a bad book, such a filthy book, such a nonsensical book was considered as a holy book by our ancestors, because it goes against common sense that hidden markers can ever resolve boundary disputes. And that is exactly what NCERT authors had in mind when they were putting these insertions. The truth is that this one shlok from Manusmriti which they have quoted is one from a series of shloks. In fact, there are 7 shloks which talk about resolution of the boundary disputes. Now I'm going to read them out for you. What Manu actually said is, for any dispute related to boundaries of 2 villages, the decision should be made in the month of Jesht, which is summers, when the boundary marks are clearly visible. This is first shlok. Then he goes on. To have clear demarcation of boundaries, the king should get trees like peepal, dhak, semal, badh, sal or other latex producing trees planted along the boundaries. Different types of bushes, creepers, bamboos should be planted along the borders. If done in this manner, the boundaries do not disappear. Then he says, ponds, wells, step wells, drains, yagyashalas and devsthans should be erected to mark the boundaries. Since boundary disputes are very frequent between kingdoms, therefore taking this fact into consideration, he should ensure other demarcations also. These demarcations should be done secretly with substances which are not easily degradable with the ravages of time and weather, like rocks, bones, hair of cow or other cattle, skulls, dry dung, bricks, coal and sand pebbles. Notice the mischief over here. The earlier 3 shloks which are talking about visible markers, they have been deliberately hidden from students, and only one shlok has been inserted to show or to create a negative image of Manusmriti. That is how a false narrative is being peddled to the students. Then another very serious issue that is with these NCERT books is that they see what happens is, now I've been reading books, history books written in different countries. What I have seen is that the history books have 2-3 main objectives when they are written. One of them is that to give a true picture of history to the students. Second is to create a grand narrative, to give confidence to the students that you belong to this great country, and so that they are full of the self-confidence and have what should I say, have that spinal cord within them that they belong to a very rich heritage. Unfortunately, these books which were launched by UPA 1 when Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister, they work to the counter of this narrative. They try to create an impression, or they try to just remove the self-confidence of the youngsters. I'll give you a few examples for this. What they do is, one method of doing it is, like I gave you the example of Manusmriti, that if you create an impression in the minds of youngsters that your past has been horrible, has been very bad, then a person can never have this confidence. There is a very common adage in English that one who controls the past controls the future. And here they are trying to control the past by creating a false narrative, which is not only derogatory to our country, but is also historically incorrect. I'll give you an example for this. This is a quotation from class 6, page number 55. However, some people, such as those who were regarded as Shudras by the priests, were excluded from many rituals. Then, on page 56 of class 6, often women were also grouped with the Shudras. Both women and Shudras were not allowed to study the Vedas. Page number 61. Page number 72. Generally, women were not allowed to study the Vedas and they had to follow the ashrams chosen by their husbands. So in class 6, when a child is 12 or 13 years of age, he's being deliberately told that your ancestors were misogynistic in nature and they had specially forbidden women folk from studying the Vedas and also Shudras from studying the Vedas. Now, what is the fact? The truth is that if you look at the Vedas, we find more than 30 women Rishikas who wrote the Vedas. That is the irony of the entire situation. That now, on the contrary, if you look at Bible or Quran, they have been written by males exclusively. These are the only scriptures, the highest form of scriptures which are revered in the land, and they have female authors, female Rishikas who wrote these books. And the narrative that is being peddled is that women were obstructed from reading Vedas. Is it ever possible that they were allowed to write? They were allowed to be authors of the books but not readers of the books. Such absurd ideas are being peddled to our students, and this has been going on for last 15 years. Then the second part is, the more insidious part is Shudras. Now, discriminating with anybody on basis of his birth is a worst form of discrimination, because the birth of a child is just an accident. He can take birth in the house of a Muslim or a Hindu or any caste. We cannot condemn that child just because of this, which is absolutely fine. Agreed with it 100%. Now, when we talk of Shudras, an impression has been created by these very books that perhaps it was based on birth. By adding that word perhaps, they've sent their message also and saved themselves from any legal tangles which they might have been involved in. Now, actually, the concept of Shudra is, there are very clear injunctions in Manusmriti also, that everybody is born a Shudra. When somebody goes to study, then he becomes a Dvij, or twice born, because that is a second birth he takes place. So the first birth is given from the womb of a mom, of a mother, and the second birth is given by the Guru, who starts teaching him or her. And anybody who does not go to study is automatically a Shudra, because he was born a Shudra, he never took that second birth. So the discrimination is not on the basis of birth, it is on the basis of education. That if somebody is not educated, how can he read Vedas? That is the import of these scriptures. But it is exactly contrary to the truth which is being taught to the students. I think I've taken my time for today's this Facebook Live. I'm going to stop here, and now I'm going to take up questions. If any one of you have any questions regarding this, kindly start posting and I'll be glad to answer them. And I'm taking this opportunity once again to thank Think Telangana, India, who have given me this opportunity to interact with you. If you have any questions, kindly post them up. I'll read them and I'll try to answer them to the best of my abilities. Okay, one question is coming from Sandeep Maduri. I suppose I've read this correctly. Why history is full of Arabs, Mughals and so on? Why is this outdated syllabus has been still hailing by the leaders of our state and country? Isn't it time to change? Okay, so there are three questions in it. Why history is full of Arabs, Mughals and so on? See, I've been saying again and again that these books, which were initiated in 2005, 2006, and even in the states, I don't know which state, Sandeep, can you kindly mention which state you are from? In any case, the problem is with every state in our country, as far as I've seen. What has happened is that Arabs and Mughals have been given a lot of prominence because of propaganda only. I told you that The template was started by Pandit Nehru even before independence. The books he wrote were in 1942 when he was so-called imprisoned. He was in so-called imprisonment, and the same family, that same narrative has been continuing till today. What is the reason for this? The reason is that we are in a civilizational war of existence. Okay, you're from Telangana. Okay, ji. Now, there is a term which is called clash of civilizations. We are the oldest civilization. If you look at the entire world, all the old civilizations have been wiped out. Today you don't see Greek civilization. It has been wiped out. You don't see Egyptian civilization. It has been wiped out. You don't see Roman civilization. All the ancient civilizations have been wiped out in last 2000 years. And they have been wiped out by the predatory ideologies. Abrahamic cults or Abrahamic religions, they are predatory in nature, and they have wiped out those civilizations because they have their avowed objective of the missionaries have this avowed objective of converting everybody to Christianity. The jihadists or Islamists have their avowed objective of converting everybody to a Muslim, to Islam. We don't have any such objective. So they are trying to convert everybody, and this is called clash of civilizations. Our civilization is also clashing with them, and so far they have been winning. And earlier they were using swords or guns, now they are using psychological tools, mind space. That is why this agenda is continuing, because the aim of these books is to wipe out this civilization. Second part of your question is, why is this outdated syllabus has been, that is same, answer to this is same. Now these leaders, what are these leaders doing? They are following very parochial, very narrow-minded politics. That is why they are doing it. And isn't it time for change? Absolutely. It is overdue. The time for change is there. What I suggest is, I suggested to everybody, the Germans had faced the same problem. After the end of Second World War, there was a section of academia in Germany who said that let us not put it in our history books that we had such terrible experiences, that there was such a kind of Holocaust that took place in Germany, but better senses prevailed. And the lawmakers decided, they created a law that anybody who denies this Holocaust should be punished. That is what should happen in our country also. We should all have a fundamental right to true history, because it is absolutely necessary for our survival, for our existence. And anybody who tries to falsify should be punished, should be given very severe punishment. That is what I suggest. Any other question from anybody? Srinivasi, good evening. Yes. Raghavi Sharma, yes. Any questions from anybody? So should I assume we don't have any further questions? Okay, so I suppose we don't have any further questions. So thanks all of you wonderful guys out there for listening to me carefully. Thank you very much. That's it for today. Namaste.